Welcome everybody to this EASD Academy webinar about perfecting your grant applications. We're very privileged to have Coen Stehouwer here, who is the Professor of Medicine at Maastricht University, and also, more pertinent to this, Chair of EFSD. Coen is going to give a short presentation to introduce this topic. And we're going to spend the majority of the time having a Q&A session. So save up your questions, and then after the presentation, I will moderate a discussion. During the discussion, please raise your hand or virtually raise your hand, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and ask your questions. So thank you very much. Over to you, Coen.
Yes, thank you, Ben, and thank you for the opportunity to do this. It's very interesting to have this conversation. Unfortunately, I'll give you the bad news first. I do not have the perfect recipe. If I had, it would be like a sort of conundrum whether I would go to share it with you. But anyway, I don't have it anyway, and I actually doubt that it exists. But having said that, we can say something about the process, I guess. And first, some general information. The EFSD, I think it started like 20 years ago. Its programs, which number more than 20, are on the website. They're very varied. And they actually range from very general to very specific, and from content dominated to person dominated. There are some personal grants like the Future Leader program. And all these programs have fairly specific requirements. So to apply means that you need to go to the website, and it also means that you should carefully read what is actually expected of any particular program, and it is not there is no unity there. It's very varied, literally. It spends the whole program spends about up to 2 million euros per year. Most of that money comes from industry, some comes from the EASD, and what the EASD and EFSD do is they try, and by and large successfully, to disconnect the content of the program from the commercial interest of the sponsor, which of course is a balancing act, as you might assume, and it truly is. So what is our procedure? And this goes for any of these programs. First, there is a check by the office staff whether the application actually conforms to basic rules. For example, the person doing the application needs to be employed by a non-profit organization. So if that's not the case, or if a collaborator is from a for-profit organization, there is a problem, and sometimes it is like a contraindication, and the application is rejected out of hand because of that formal reason. And sometimes it is something that can be managed by presenting it another way, or by listing somebody not as a collaborator but as a contact somewhere else. That is doable, and by and large the office staff are trying to manage this in a positive sense. And then these committees often, but not always, start by a triage round. That's mostly the case if there is a large number of applications. And also if the expectation is that only a percentage of that large number can be can finally be accorded. Committees typically consist of about 6 persons with a chair. The chair manages that committee. It's different for each program. There are programs, and this is all actually on the website, that receive like 80 applications, of which, let's say, 12 to 13 can be granted at the end of the day. In such cases, there is or there will be a triage round. If the number of applications is much lower, and if, let's say, 50% of applications can be granted at the end of the day, this triage round can be skipped. Triage round involves a fairly superficial assessment. And some of you who may have tried and not got through the triage round will have had this letter saying that you have not passed the triage round and we cannot tell you why. Personally, I think that that is one of the weaker parts of the procedure and also somewhat unsatisfactory because there are no comments on content. But the problem that needs to be managed here is the large number and, of course, the limited number of people in such a committee. To go to do in-depth comments on every application is simply too much work. So that's why what the triage round is for. Then after the triage round is done, the committee will be at the step where about 30 to 50% of the number of applications remaining can be granted at the end of the day, or perhaps 20 to 50%. These applications are then considered in depth, and they are commented on in writing in depth. And these comments are shared at the committee meeting. And this meeting basically is a verbal discussion where any grant application has a primary reviewer, a secondary reviewer, and these will be, as much as possible, be people that are experts on that particular field or in that particular field. And the rest of the committee will join that discussion and will also have seen the application. And then at the end of the day, there will be a list, depending on how much money there is, and there will be a proposal of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 12 in some programs, grants to be approved. And this is a proposal to the executive board of the EFSD, and they will actually formally approve. And normally that is just a formal step that has no content. Normally the executive board follows the advice of the committee. So that's the procedure, and many of you will have been aware of that procedure, perhaps been victims of that procedure. We'll see. Now I took over as chair a few years ago from Michael Roden, and I noted that by and large the funding is often quite low and therefore not consistent with the level of ambition expected. And that, I think, creates some sort of conundrum, especially because in the original text, co-funding of applications was sort of discouraged. We are moving away from that because the problem is, I think, that the level of ambition requires basically more money than is often available in any grant, and the solution there can only be co-funding, which of course does not mean that you can fund the same thing twice, but it does mean that the EFSD part of the funding can be part of a larger project. That creates dependency and that will need to be managed, but nevertheless we are moving into that direction. And we are also moving in the direction of more stringent assessment of interim and final reports, because my impression is a little bit that because the funding was not consistent with the level of ambition expected, there was often quite a gap between what was initially promised and what was finally done. And of course, there is the money problem in between. And we will have to do away with that as well. So we will be, in the next years, I think, be more stringently assessing and comparing what was promised in the initial application to what was actually done. And here is my very personal list of things I think that will be noted by many reviewers as strong points in an application. Oh, I see there's a typo there. But the first strong point is that it should be close to the RFE text. RFE means request for application. So any program has a sort of a text of what is meant by the program. And the closer an application is to that text, the more it conforms to the idea behind that text, the better, I think, are your chances of getting it granted. By and large, if even in a general program we have two applications that are equally strong, but one, say, is about obesity without diabetes and the other is about diabetes, the diabetes one will get it. That is logical because at the end of the day, we are, of course, a society that not only looks at diabetes, but also at the determinants of diabetes. But faced with a choice, we will probably quite often go for the diabetes program rather than, let's say, the obesity program or something that precedes diabetes. Another very strong point and important is, I think, is to show preliminary work in a application. If you promise something that is technically difficult or that is thought to be technically difficult, it is important to show that you can actually do this. And it can be published work or not published work. That is not, I think, the key issue here, although published work will be peer reviewed, so it has a higher standing, but nevertheless, preliminary work is a very important point to consider. Some reflections on the power of the study, the number of people or animals, or the number of things you're going to do in relation to the question you need to ask. And although the RFA text always says that you should reflect on power, it's very often omitted. And that can be like a fatal error, especially if in truth, I think most of you will know that there is a lot of subjectivity in whether you like a grant or not as a reviewer. But if you really don't like a grant or don't like it very much, and there is no sort of idea of what the power is, that can be a fatal thing for that assessment. Another important criterion is reflections on feasibility. Can it actually be done? Can it be done technically? But also, can it be done in terms, for example, of patient or participant recruitment? Now, we all know that, or we'll know, perhaps most of you know, those involved in clinical research will know that recruitment is very often the most important, difficult thing. And it is very often underestimated and much too optimistic, especially when people go for very sort of specific criteria. Patients or participants must have A, B, C, D, E, but they cannot have 7 other things. Well, and if you then promise to find 100 of such patients or participants, then people who have been in this game for a long time know that that is almost impossible. So you need to strike a balance there. Strong points for personal grants are listed there. I think they are traditional. I think EFSD finds them important, and many other funding agencies find them important as well. Having worked abroad or elsewhere compared to where you are now. Experience perhaps as a supervisor of master's students or PhD students. Earlier earning power. And very often also depends, of course, on the career stage, a mentor, having a mentor who is respected in the field. So you come from a certain background. These, I think, are strong points. And this is my final slide, and this is very personal. These, I think, these things listed here are, I think, very often reviewer biases. They are criteria that really shouldn't be there, but they are often there. And you may not agree. You may say these are correct criteria. It should be done like that. I don't think so. But nevertheless, this is what many reviewers apparently do in my experience. And because science is also a sociological enterprise, it is important to be aware of such biases and perhaps even play into them. So yes, I think reviewers very often are sensitive to the fashion of the day. Reviewers at the EFSD, I think, are biased towards what they consider mechanistic work, that you can say something about causality according to their particular ideas or concepts of causality. So mechanistic work, by and large, is very often preferred in whatever sense. It also means, because it's the converse of that, that there is a bias, very unfairly, I think, against observational epidemiology. Personally, I think that a good observational epidemiological study is much better than a poorly designed experiment, even for causal inference. Many people would not agree with this, with what I just said. Nevertheless, I think it is important for you to consider this. I know for a fact that observational epidemiological studies without any sort of added experiment or mechanistic insight are very often rejected throughout these programs. So it's important for you to know that. Maybe unfair or incorrect, but that's the way it is. Conversely, the importance of representativeness is very often downplayed. Reviewers tend to like, more often than not, a small mechanistic study in a very limited number of people, so with problems automatically of external validity and of generalizability. They tend to find that less important than the fact that it is a mechanistic study. And funnily enough, and this relates to all these earlier sort of biases, there very often is a lack of methodological expertise among at least some reviewers. People will have strong views, for example, on how statistics should be applied, but very often I don't think that these strong views are very well founded. You need, I think, to consider that and try to play into that. It also means, for example, that if you prefer a certain type of analysis or method, that it is often wise to give a reference, to tell the reviewers, I'm doing this in this way, and this is my source. And of course, it best be an external and authoritative source on methods in that case. So I'll stop it here, and I think I've spent about 80 minutes or something, and I'll be happy to sort of discuss with you what you think of all this, and perhaps answer some of your questions, if I can. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Coen. And yeah, so I invite anyone with questions around this topic to raise your hand, and I will moderate and ask you to unmute yourself. And so maybe while you're thinking of some questions, I can ask one. Coen, this is a young academy, so predominantly people here will be looking at the early stage awards that EFSD offer. And in the very near future, there's the Rising Star and the Young Investigator Award coming up. Maybe you can speak a little bit to those awards and the prestigiousness of those, and maybe specific things that people that the committee will look for in that type of award.
Yes, it must be said, I have personal experience in the committees of a number of these programs that we have, but unfortunately not in the more person-based programs. My impression, though, is that it comes down to basically this list for personal grants. And I could add to that what is extremely powerful is that if you have a paper or more papers in, let's say, a top journal, that's often very persuasive to people in such committees. Personally, I realize that that is a very tricky criterion, because if you have, let's say, a work that you have published in a top journal, there is often some form of almost luck included. And that is basically because all these top journals are quite sensitive to publication bias. By and large, they will publish things that are topical and that are like positive, and that give an insight that people had expected more or less to be there. So it's not too far away from what is current thinking, but it does make a sort of a next step, and it is a positive thing. Now, if you have very creatively and diligently done that work, and you have been lucky to have, let's say, a positive result, you may have a paper in a top journal if you've done exactly the same work, but unfortunately your hypothesis was not confirmed. It's still the same amount of work and it's the same amount of creativity, but your chance of ending up in a top journal is much, much less. Nevertheless, this is the way it works. So adding to the 4 points I noted here, I could add a paper in a top journal is, I think, also an important criterion. Excellent. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that is, I think, still these are the things that are important to show, because in personal grants it's about the person and about the creativeness and the talentedness of that particular person. And if you then go to some form of criteria, you get this kind of lists.
Yes, and I agree. One other thing on this list is you've got a mentor who is respected in the field. Now, we're not all lucky enough to work for someone who is well known or well established. Maybe some of us work for very exciting and precocious young PIs. How can one who maybe doesn't work for someone who is well known maybe overcome this, or could that be through collaboration, for example, or what would be your advice to someone who maybe doesn't work for someone like yourself?
I think the thinking behind having such a mentor or having such a background is saying something about perhaps continuity, saying something also about if you get this grant and if you run into trouble, will there be help in the vicinity? And I think my best advice, I think, would be, if you do not have such a mentor or a mentor for about whom people would think, okay, this is automatically okay, just say, you know, I am in an environment where there are a number of people that I collaborate with, or that basically sort of can play this role, that are like people that I can talk to when things are, when surprising thing happens or when unexpected things happen, or people that I can talk to advance my thinking. For some people, you know, this having such a mentor is like an automatic thing, because there are these people who are well known in the field. But the thinking about it is that you need people to talk to, and you could, of course, simply tell the reviewers, I have such people to talk to, and perhaps name them, even if they are not like your formal mentor.
Excellent. And I'll add to that. It's not yet advertised, but upcoming, the EASD Academy, in collaboration with EFSD, is going to run a mentorship program for 1 year, where you can apply to establish a mentorship with a significant individual within the field. So potentially that could be one avenue. Alex, you've had your hand up.
Hi, how you going? Thanks for your talk. I was interested in the kind of the Younger Investigator Awards. You said that they're more related to the person, the individual themselves. So what about the track record in publications? Does that need to be related to diabetes, or can it be in and around metabolism, not directly related to diabetes? And how does that stand in the application?
I think that's a very good question. And there is an important, again, unfortunately, an important degree of perhaps subjectivity or variability in what reviewers think. My impression is that if your application, the content of your application, is relatively close to your prior experience, that's basically okay. If it's not if it's not precisely about diabetes, but let's say it's about obesity or something close to diabetes, and if your experience is also in that, that's still okay. I think people get a little bit concerned if what you're going to do is quite far away from your prior experience, especially also technically, because people will feel you need to probably have had some experience in this particular field to truly understand its sort of problems. And then if you go from one field to another, of course, against that is that you're almost telling people you can never change your field. You have to sort of, and people are sort of also aware of that disadvantage of this particular criterion. So I do think, however, that if you are sort of changing fields a little bit in an application, so if your prior experience is not really similar to what you're proposing now, I think you should meet that problem head on. Talk about it in your application. Tell the reviewers why you want to change, or why you are proposing something that is a bit different from your prior experience, and show them that you realize that this step involves some extra difficulties. Perhaps add, if you can, that you have faced that kind of difficulty before and successfully resolved it. So apparently you are, as an applicant, you are resilient, and you realize that these problems exist, but you can overcome them. Do not, I think, do not downplay them. Because if you see a problem as a reviewer, and it's the same, I think, if you read a paper, if you see a problem, and if the writer or the applicant actually talks about the problem, then you as a reviewer, as a reader, will feel happy, because your thinking apparently is also the thinking of the applicant. If, on the other hand, you sort of ignore or downplay the problem, people will become even more worried, because they will reason, okay, but this applicant does not even see this problem, or doesn't want to talk about the problem, and both are wrong or both are bad. That would be my advice. Meet it head on.
Excellent. Katerina, you've got your hand up. Before you say something, apparently we've had some problems with raising hands, and hopefully that's been sorted. But if you're struggling to raise your hand, you can just put a message in the chat and I'll come to you as well.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Coen. So can you tell us a little bit more on the triage process? Because that's the very first step, so we don't get a feedback. And so what do reviewers look at? What is your advice, if any?
As I said, I think the triage step is the weakest point in the procedure. And if we could do without it, pragmatically, I would be happy to sort of delete the triage step. Because what happens is that the entire committee are asked to review briefly all applications. So imagine you are a reviewer on such a committee and you face 50 to 80 applications. How much time are you going to spend on them? At most 10 minutes, at most. I think, and this is pure speculation, that people will be different in how they spend these 10 minutes. I can tell you what I do. I read the abstract, and then if I don't understand the abstract, even if after trying it twice, I may simply stop reading. So the abstract is important. And then I sort of glance through the application, doing like checks. Has this person worked in this field before? Is there something from the abstract about power, feasibility, representativeness that I can quickly find? Now, there are these items in the application where you need to talk about that. So I would try and get there quickly and try to see whether I can find them. So a trick not consistently employed by people, but I think useful, is to highlight certain text, certain parts of text, where you want people to find what you're saying, like printing it in bold or highlighting it in any other fashion, making it easy to find. I'm not interested in the financials at this point in time. I'm not, at least. I am interested in track record, feasibility, logic. But then I can spend only 10 minutes, so I need to be able to find it quickly, and it is usually like 25 pages. So it needs to be something you can easily find. This would be, I think, my experience, and other people may do it in different manners. I actually don't know. It's an interesting question, how people do this. I do think, however, that unfortunately there is a relatively high subjectivity at this level, and that rejection may be almost by chance. Again, this is impression because we have never sort of formally evaluated these things. I do, however, note that quite often, if you get to the level of discussion in the committee meeting, so if you get beyond the triage, that quite often you see that people on the committee will change their mind, both upward and downward, about an application, because basically they have missed something. And another committee member will have noticed that, and this will come to the fore in the meeting discussion, and people actually adjust their thinking, which is good. But that must mean that this effect is also there at triage level. People simply, reviewers, make mistakes. And these mistakes are, of course, basically not corrected because they are not discussed. And therefore, I think that at the triage level, you have a higher chance of being unfairly rejected than at later parts of the later parts are of better quality, I would guess. But that's the way it is, unfortunately.
Thank you. Somehow this is reassuring. I mean, you know, it may be that a good quality thing was rejected, not because it was very poor, but just because
Yeah.
by chance. But thank you.
Yes, to some extent, but of course you cannot turn it around. You cannot say if it's rejected, it was because of a mistake. That's not what I'm saying. And I do give you this advice. Make it as easy as possible for reviewers to find what they are probably looking for. Highlight things, use boxes, make a figure. Do all the tricks that you do for a presentation.
Thank you.
Patrick, you've put on the message board that the abstract's really important too, and you've got some experience of reviewing these sorts of grants and at ERC level 2. Have you got anything else to say about how to get noticed at the early stage?
Thanks, Ben. No, I agree completely with Coen. I mean, it's like Coen says. I mean, you face, if you're a reviewer in the board in this committee, then you face like 80 applicants, and you have to review them in a short period of time. So indeed, highlight things that are important, and don't underestimate the abstract. My feeling is that sometimes applicants write the abstract in the end, and they think, okay, it's not so important. But as a reviewer, of course, that's the first thing that you're going to read. So, and I think that's also what Coen said.
So we've got a question from Maurizio. Would you like to ask your question yourself, Maurizio, or would you like me to read it out? Speak up if you would like to read it.
Okay, go ahead. You can repeat yourself. Thank you.
Okay. Maurizio said, and then a couple of other people have agreed that this is an interesting question. Why do we not get feedback to applications that are not funded? Explaining why the application was not funded or sent out for evaluation would help for understanding how to improve it for a new submission.
Yes, I basically think it's the workload that is here. That I agree that this would be something that we would like to do if we had the capacity to do it. And again, this is most, I think this is most sharply felt at the triage level. I mean, you do get, once you get to the final list, you do get some comments back. Sometimes they are extensive, sometimes not. It depends a little bit on the diligence of the chair of the particular program, because the chair is the person who needs to organize this and actually do it. Now these chairs are busy people, and we sometimes have some problems in eliciting these texts, but we do strive to get them, and I do take the point that it is something that we should be striving to do. Then again, you must realize that even if a committee gives you a certain advice, next year the committee may be different, may have different opinions, not always. It could be more or less the same committee. Chairs of committees are usually appointed for 3 years and can have one further 3-year extension. So there's continuity there, but the members of committees are much less continuous. They're often selected or on the advice of the chair. Some people, they are also, because these members then need to be able to meet at the meeting, so they often, or at least regularly, will not be able to join the meeting, and then they excuse themselves from the as a committee member. So there is more, there is less continuity there. Nevertheless, I do agree that if you have, or it is true that if you have an application that was rejected last time for specific reasons, and if you now have a new application that makes steps in improving the criticisms that were raised earlier, that is a strong point, and most committees will actually consider that. So that's how it works, I guess.
And maybe extending this point a little bit, I'm sure you've been on both sides of this. You both had to reject applications, and I'm sure you've had grant applications rejected yourself. What should
Never.
we do when we get our rejection back and we're like, right, okay, there's these other ones I can apply for, or it's the same one next year. What are you thinking, and what steps can you take to give yourself a better chance the following time?
If you're applying for the same program, then carefully considering the criticisms raised is, I think, essential. Because if you come back at the same program, and if you basically are doing the same proposal, you'll probably get rejected. So can you do that? Then you can apply for the same program. If you cannot or will not do that, you could, of course, consider applying for a different program. These programs are mutually independent. It is not that that rejection in program A has anything to say about rejection in program B. There are different committees. They are not interdependent, and they are simply different people. And of course, there are different programs. So that's another. There are some general programs where sort of anything goes. These are the most difficult to get into because they're basically the number of applications is highest. And there are much more specific programs, and you can actually try either.
Great. Teresa has a great question. Is age of the applicant considered during the evaluation of the proposal? Young applicants have less experience, publication, and funding than senior applicants, and I think you read this a lot on the website when or the outline is that individuals be assessed based on their career level. How much does that actually take place, and how much of it is, the more senior you are and the more publications you have, the more probability you've got?
It is truly difficult to say because I as a chair do not have an overview over all these programs. I do think that there is some bias towards, there used to be, at least traditionally, some bias to sort of grant people that you think, okay, we know them, they can do this work, fine. Then again, more and more people are realizing that this basically is unfair towards younger applicants. So people are sort of stepping back from that sort of old habit. Now, some committees may be more, liberal or more advanced in changing that than others. It's difficult to say because I actually don't know, but you hear this in committees that we should not always, give the money to the usual suspects. Then again, what you want to know from a younger applicant is some reassurance, again, that what he or she proposes is actually feasible. And because if you think about it, you want to spend this money wisely. So what you want is good science, or as good science as possible, being produced or helped by this money. So you don't want it to sort of give it to someone where you think, okay, well, high risk. And so if you are this young person with a relatively limited track record, tell the reviewer that you have carefully, again, considered feasibility and that you have thought about all these things, so that you sort of give the reviewers the reassurance that the money will be well spent if we give it to you. Because, of course, the experience and the older experienced person, it's a proxy for a safe investment. I don't think people want to make, give that money specifically to these people. They want to make a safe investment. Now, if you think that that is the criterion, what people are looking for, then try to reassure them. I mean, truly, if you are a young person with no experience in field A and you do something technically difficult proposal in field A, that clearly is not a safe investment. It wouldn't be if it were your money at your house either. So that would be stretching it. But there are many things in between. If you are a young person and you want to do something that is feasible in the environment that you are working in, you can use that. I think people are moving in the right direction in the sense that they are moving away from just looking at prior publications, and if it's less than 12, next application. That perhaps was the tradition more or less, but people are getting more enlightened there. Yeah, but my advice is try to reassure reviewers that you are a safe investment.
Patrick.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Coen just said, because I completely agree. I think my experience in the times that I was in the review committee is indeed that people tend to also see that it's important to support young researchers. But what is especially strong if you have an experienced mentor and then a young researcher who is applying. So again, I think putting this importance of having a mentor, and of course some of us are lucky that you have a good mentor yourself, but if you don't, reach out to people, ask them if they want to read your application and support it in whatever way, even if, like Coen said before, you have talked to someone that's in the field and that's an authority, and this can already help. I think, yeah, that's what I wanted to add. I think that's really important. And I know that's more difficult for some younger researchers, but yeah, again, also as a young academy, I think that's something we want to work on to make this possible for everyone. But
So keep an eye out for the mentorship program. Again.
Yeah, it's not only the advertisement for that, but I think what Coen's saying, I mean, I do see that we're moving away a little bit from giving the money only to the usual suspects, but also I think as the EASD, you also see, okay, we want to support young people, but of course you also want to get value for your money. That's also how it should be, because you don't want to just put the money out there and then nothing happens. So that balance, that's important.
And I'd like to add to that as Patrick is saying, ask other people to read your grant and basically to spend some time on advising you. I think most of us will have had the experience that you read a paper in a journal and you're so happy with this paper in the sense that every time when you read that, at every point that you read this paper, that you think, yes, but. And then like the next paragraph will go into your but, right? They will actually answer the question that popped up in your mind. And so you read this paper and you think, okay, these authors, they think like I do. When they see something, they ask a question, they provide an answer. Now, at the level of applications, there's also this experience. I sometimes have the experience, and it's really not dependent, I don't think, on who actually writes it. I'm actually convinced that many applications by senior people are not actually written by senior people. So some of them are very poorly sort of reasoned. But sometimes you have this application where you think, yes, this is logic. You answer, you do a proposal, you have a question, and the answer is given, or the idea is further discussed in the next paragraph. So this has this 5-star logic. And it's very difficult to give a recipe, but it's like an elephant. I don't know what the recipe is for an elephant, but I recognize it when I see one. And sometimes you have this feeling with an applicant, with an application, you say, yes, this is an elephant. And that is very convincing. And that, I think, will convince people regardless of your seniority. Now, the point is, how do you know that it's an elephant? The best advice I can give you is have other people read it before you send it in.
Yeah. And so also, I suppose, don't be too scared of highlighting risks and mitigations, right? When I was starting to write grants a few years ago, I was really scared. I was like, right, there's this hole in it. And if I put it in the risk and mitigations, everyone's going to see that there's this hole in it, right? And actually, the people assessing your grants are clever enough to see that hole if I can see that hole. So I should raise that and say how I'm going to, ward off those risks, right?
That's a very good point. And I think so too. I'm not sure what reviewers by and large thinks, but I agree with you. This is linked in my mind to something else, which is the interdependency of the parts of the package. So if you have like 3 steps, and step 2 is it depends on step 1. That's a conundrum because very often that's logical to do that. Nevertheless, people may say yes, but if step 1 does not work, what are you again gonna do? Well, there are 2 ways about it. You could say, well, okay, then we'll close it down and we will not ask for the money. You don't often see that, but I think it is an idea. And or you need to make it so that your step 1 is relatively low risk. Might go wrong, but it's not very likely to go wrong. I'm not sure about how people, when I am on review boards, so not as a chair, but just simply talking to people, they assess this differently. For some, it's a big disadvantage, the interdependency. And some say, well, yes, okay, but this is the way these things are done. And I don't think that there is much consensus of how to do this. Nevertheless, I think the interdependency, again, is something that my advice would be to meet it head on, to talk about it in your grant. Don't ignore it. Because some people are worried about it. Some reviewers, I mean, are worried about it.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes left. So if everyone's got any questions, please raise your hand or get them into the chat now. I'll ask, you might have an overview of this, particularly with the EFSD, how sort of important, what is the sort of repeat success, right? So if I'm a young researcher and I get a Rising Star or a Young Investigator Award, is that going to count for me when maybe I go for the Future Leader Award or something like that?
Good question. And the honest answer is I don't know. Because for these particular review committees, I've never been on them. It's certainly not a formal criterion. To the extent that it is a marker of success, your next application will be influenced by your prior application. And if that prior application was successful, that will count in your favor. But is it important that it is at the EFSD? To my mind, really not. I don't see why an EFSD grant should be more important than any other grant, as long as it is a competitive grant. but for some people may be different, may think differently about this. It's certainly not something that is formally considered, that if you have, let's say, the one, then you should be prioritized for the next.
Thank you. And then I suppose, oh, Pierre, you asked a question. I've asked loads.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you, Coen, for this presentation. One thing I'm wondering is about preliminary data, because you said it's very important to show the feasibility. But as a young researcher, sometimes you don't have that much preliminary data. So how should you try to generate your first preliminary data? And how can you use literature to support your hypothesis to say this is going to be feasible and doable, even if I haven't done it yet?
Well, I think you're more or less, it's a good question, and I think you're more or less providing the answer. If you truly have no preliminary data, then the next best thing is that you reassure the reviewers that this is doable, and that it is doable because other people have done it, and because it is more or less something that has been done in the environment that you work in, or something similar has been done. Again, I think it is the preliminary data have the function of providing reassurance. If you can't provide reassurance in that particular manner, try to provide it in another manner. Truly, if you cannot do that either, then yeah, then you're facing a challenge. It must come from somewhere, clearly, mostly. And even if you would argue that that is not fair, then you will be competing with other grants that do have that advantage. And by and large, you will not be prioritized over those other grants applications. And that also is fair, because to some extent they are, they are providing more reassurance, and that should count as well. Yeah, so getting started is difficult. And if you truly need to get started from, let's say, nothing, that is very difficult. And EFSD, I think, is not different from other funding agencies. They worry about that.
Thank you.
I was muted. Friedrich, quick question and a quick answer. We've got about 2 minutes left.
Hi, I just want to ask about the abstract. So most of the time I was torn between writing it in a scientific English or in a Latin English. What do you usually suggest we should write the abstract?
I'm not sure I got the question. Is it about language?
Yeah, so lay versus scientific language in the abstract specifically.
Oh, lay or scientific?
Yeah.
Well, by and large, scientific, I would guess.
Great. So that brings up the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank Coen for joining us and giving us some insight into the EFSD and attracting grants in grant funding in general. Patrick's just put a comment in the chat to everyone. Yes, please give us feedback to let us know what you'd like to hear about in the future. And that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. On the 2nd of February, we have our sister program, which is the Journal Club. We have, for that particular one, Joanne Balderson from the University of Exeter is going to talk to us about gene expression profiling in NOD mice. It reveals that beta cells are highly educated by the pancreatic environment during autoimmune diabetes. So I think that will be very interesting. Katarina's put the link to the Academy into the chat, so you can click on that and see everything that we're doing. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.